Hi everyone, welcome back to another Blender tutorial. Today will be part 2 of our environment design tutorial of a fall scene. And today we'll be adding more realistic environment layers to our fall scene that we made in part 1. Not half bad. But we're going to be sprinkling a little bit of magic on it, and we're going to end up with that in part 2. Before we get into it, please make sure to like and subscribe down below. It really helps the channel out, and make sure you hit that bell because you don't want to miss out on any future Blender tutorials or any 3D printing tutorials. Channel and the community is growing so fast right now, and I'm so excited. I have some tier challenges as we grow this community that will be coming out as we grow and as the channel grows. So once we hit 500 subscribers, there's going to be a big 3D printing challenge that I'll take on and make something from the computer and bring it into reality. But that's enough intro. You came here for a environment design tutorial, so let's get into it. Welcome back to our fall scene, and today we're going to step the scene up a little bit and make it a little more realistic, just by adding in some simple details like atmosphere layers, a particle system for blowing leaves since it's fall, and then I want to adjust the rotation on some of these trees here and potentially get some movement in the grass. So let's open up our Blender scene again. And now back in Blender, we can deactivate our particle systems to make them not viewable in the viewport. That way our computer's not struggling while we move through the viewport. And if you need to, you can hide some of these big land pieces too to save more render power too. So to start, I think the easiest one we can do is add in our atmosphere layers, which will just be planes with gradients. So let's get into that. And we'll want to add in a plane to our midground collection. Scale it up, rotate on the X, and then rotate on the Z to put into place. Move our plane in between these mountains here. Scale it on the X. Scale on Z. Let's go to our camera view and bring it up. Let's make it not cast a shadow. Then let's open up our shader editor. So add a new texture to the plane, and then let's add in a gradient. And we can plug this into the alpha. Let's map the gradient with Control T. And then let's add in a hue, saturation, and value node. Let's change the value to a 0.6. Increase our roughness to 1. And then to see where this gradient is, we can Control Shift and left click on our hue saturation node to view it. So for my gradient, I ended up with the mapping being on the X location 0.62, on the Z rotation 90 degrees. I left it a linear gradient. The value is a 0.6, and then I changed the base color to the hex of E7D5C1. One of the things that we'll just need to do is just move this mountain back here, just back a little bit so it's not clipping into this plane. And then we can duplicate this gradient for our background mountains. And put it between the background mountains and the sky. And we'll need to scale this plane up. And then we'll need to duplicate the gradient so we don't adjust the first one. And we can move this second plane into our background collection. Another atmosphere layer that we can add is a cloud layer that will cast clouds over our scene here. Since our sky image has a lot of clouds, it'll add a little more realism and movement to our scene. So for this plane, we want it to be affecting each layer when we render it out again. So keep it in your main scene collection, and let's add in another plane. Scale it up. Bring it above your scene. Let's create a new texture for this plane, and we can label it clouds.001. And let's add in a noise texture and plug it into the alpha. And then we want to map our noise texture with Control T, and let's add in a color ramp. Let's adjust the contrast a little bit. Let's set the scale to 8, detail of 3, and a roughness of 0.4. And then let's add some distortion of a 0.05. And then on the mapping, you can play around with the scale to get matching clouds. So the scale on the X for mine is a 1.17 and the Y is a 0.93. And then we just want to place this plane in a position where it will be casting shadows over our scene but not in the camera view. So for this cloud layer, what I ended up doing was I created a plane, enlarged it, added a noise texture and a color ramp, mapped our noise texture out, and I changed the noise texture scale to a 12.43, detail is a 3, roughness is a 0.4, and then I bumped up the contrast a little bit here. And then on our scale for the mapping, I have the X at a 1.62 and the Y at a 0.93. And then you can see here that it's casting shadows on our landscape here. Now that we have our atmosphere layers, we can start tackling our particle systems with our trees to add a little more variation on the rotation and a little more randomness with it. We can start editing our particle systems one by one with our midground mountains here. So let's bring them up in our viewport. So for this first midground trees particle, I adjusted the rotation phase to a 0.002 and the randomness phase to a 0.067. I adjusted the scale to a 0.454 and then the scale randomness to a 0.447. Render amount for children is 20 still. And now let's move on to the next one. And since these are on the same layer, we can adjust them similarly. So for the second particle system of trees in our midground, my randomness on the y-axis is a 0.118. The phase is a 0.01. I left the randomness phase at a 0. Scale I adjusted to a 0.514. Scale randomness 0.374. And then 20 children in the render amount as well. And now we can move on to our background mountains. So for the background mountains, I adjusted our particle system. For on our rotation, the random is 0.171, phase negative 0.032, random phase 0.182, scale 0.254, scale randomness 0.481, and then the display, our render amount is going to be 30. And then for our second background mountain, render amount 30, our scale same is 0.254, scale randomness 0.5, and then randomize for the rotation is a 0.08, phase negative 0.128, and random phase 0.15. Now that we adjusted our particle systems to have a little more randomness, we can start on our leaf particle system with the wind. And for this, I'm going to bring in a reference image of some aspen leaves. I brought in this one because we'll use this for our base model. And then I brought this one in for the color variations. And I'm thinking we can get some of the gradients and like the color transitions from like the orange to greens and orange to yellows, some of the red. So shout out Kristen Link for doing this image. It's going to help me today, so thank you. So to start with a leaf, what we need to do is bring in a plane. So add in a mesh plane. And then with your plane placed, we can jump into edit mode and activate X-ray. And with vertices select, we can grab these two. Can make it a point and bring it up here. And we can scale this out to follow our leaf here. And then just add in loop cuts to add in more geometry and follow the look of our leaf here. And then with edge select, we can extrude. And scale as we go. Extrude again. And then we can go back into vertices select and adjust some of these vertices. And then for the stem here, we can extrude out just a little bit. And then scale and bring it to our stem here. And now we can follow the stem. So just extrude again and scale. Rotate when needed and extrude more. And now we can add in more loop cuts just to add in the texture on the edges here. I'm not going to go exact, but I do like the rigid edges of the aspen leaves, so maybe we could get that. Probably not even a detail that will be noticeable in the animation, but just for good modeling practice, I like to do that. Now that we have our leaf modeled out, we can add a level 2 subdivision modifier, and let's add in a solidify modifier. Doesn't need to be too thick, just a little bit of thickness, and we can bring it up here, that way it rounds off the edges. Shade smooth, and then what else we can do is apply the scale, and then in edit mode with face select all faces and unwrap the model. And then from here what we want to do is just take this model and duplicate it a couple times and edit each model just a little bit. And you can do this in edit mode or you can do it in sculpt mode too. Just add different variations of the leaf, and to stay organized we can name this leaf.001, copy the name and add it to these 02 and 03. Now let's edit this third leaf. And I think we can get away with maybe 5 different leaves just to add variation. I like the way our leaves look, so now all we need to do is apply some color to it. So let's see if we can get away with just using some gradient textures and adjusting the color ramp to get a fall leaf. So let's go to material preview, and with our first leaf selected, let's add a new texture, and we can label this leaf.001. And first things first, we can add in a gradient texture, plug it into the base color, and with the gradient texture selected, we can Control T to map it, and then we can add in a color ramp so we could adjust the colors. So for this first leaf color, I just did a gradient of a yellow to an orange using a color ramp gradient texture on the spherical setting. And I adjusted my location a bit to make the circle be about right here. That way there's an edge of the orange and a transition into the yellow. So my location ended up being on the X -0.43, on the Y -0.54, and I left the scale at 1. And then I brought the roughness down to a 0.35. And then now for the next leaf we can just duplicate our texture. And for this one we can make this more of a orange to red. And now we can see if we can mix in a noise texture or just another texture in general to add more variation to this gradient. And that's a pretty leaf texture there. So for leaf 2, I mixed in a noise texture, adjusted the scale to a 0.35, increased the detail to 15. I mixed it with our gradient texture and changed it to a multiply, and then just changed the colors to make it a red to an orange transition. You technically also could just get the UV maps of each leaf and then go into Photoshop and draw or color your own leaf textures and then just import it in with an image texture, which we might do that in a future video. But let's save this texture here and move on to the next one. So we need a green to yellow. We need a full red leaf. We'll figure out what we're going to do next after that. So let's try deleting this noise texture, and maybe let's play around with a Voronoi texture. Looks like the Voronoi texture might not work too well. Or I'm not liking how it's mixing right now. Let's see what other textures we can play with. Let's try using a different noise texture. And we can add in a color ramp. I like the mixture of this noise texture with the gradient. So I use the noise texture scale of 6.1, detail of 15. I left the roughness at 0.5. Lacunarity I changed to a 2.9, and then distortion a 1.8. And then I adjusted the contrast of the noise textures as well before I put it into our mix node here. So now we just need to adjust this to be a green to yellow mixture. That looks really good. Oh, and we forgot to duplicate the texture, so we were editing this one here. It's a good mistake for you to see me do because it happens quite often. Always remember to duplicate your textures before you start editing them again. So all we need to do is just edit this. You can leave that as leaf 2 and just adjust this to leaf 1 again. We'll just need to switch the colors back to red and orange. And there we go, we can save that for our leaf 3. Just taking out the color ramp and changing the colors back. So now let's do a full red leaf one. Duplicate the texture this time. And I think that'll look good for our red leaf. Let's save that texture. So now to add in the particle system for our leaves, we can add in a plane. Scale it up. This will be our particle emitter. So we can keep it roughly the size of our foreground piece here. And then let's rotate on our Y. Let's bring it up on the Z above our scene. And then we want to bring it out of the way of our camera because we want the leaves to be falling into camera shot. So let's just position our plane to where it needs to be. And then what we can do is add a particle system, make it an emitter system, and we can name this leaves .001 and name the particle settings leaves .001. We can change the number to about 500. We can check rotation, render as a collection, and we want to pick our leaves collection. And for our frame start, we can have it be negative 100 and the end be 400, so it's past the end of our animation, and our lifetime here is the lifespan of particles. I believe it is per frame, so right now it'll last for 50 frames, which would end up being 1 second, almost 2 seconds. So we can try that for now, and then we can add lifetime randomness of maybe a 0.2, and we can adjust our scale here. There we go. Now we have our leaves here. Let's leave our scale at 2, and we can increase the number to 750. And now let's add randomize to our rotation. That's a good randomization here. We could add scale randomization too now. Let's do maybe a 0.3. So what I'm noticing here is you can see that the leaves are disappearing too soon. So let's change our lifetime 150, so about half the animation. And our start could be negative 150. And now I'm noticing we can extend the lifetime even more. So let's adjust it to 200. And now what we want to do is add in a wind force. So Shift A, and then it will be in force fields. Add a wind. And then with our wind force scaled up, we can adjust the strength and flow and the noise amount too. So let's increase our strength. And let's see if this will be a good strength for it. And we can move our particle system a little closer to our scene here. And you can see that the leaves are disappearing as they come into frame, and we want to adjust that. So we will need to adjust our lifetime on the leaves again. Let's make it 300. Let's see the difference there. And we can bring our particle system and the wind force down. And now we can test this in our viewport. Can maybe increase the strength of our winds so they fly off to the side of our screen here and through the scene. Let's increase our strength to 35. And then we can add in a turbulence force now to add in more variation as the leaves fall. And then we can adjust the strength and noise. But let's adjust our noise amount here in our wind. Let's adjust the noise amount to like a 7. And then let's go back into our turbulence. And the strength of our wind is a 35, so our turbulence could maybe be, let's see how a 10 does. Increase the noise amount as well. And now let's see how these leaves are falling. I'm liking how this is looking. Now let's adjust the size of our turbulence. Now we got good coverage over our foreground here. Now we just need to make sure the rotation of everything is going to be changing while it moves, all that stuff. So let's go back into our rotation here, and we can add the randomize to 1, our phase to 1, and let's bump our random phase to about a 1.5. And then we can adjust the strength of our turbulence again. Let's make it a 20 to see what that does. Let's make our size bigger. Let's do a 7.5 for the noise amount. And this is why you always test everything, because you check it before you render, that way you don't waste your time while your computer struggles to render everything. Now let's test our animation. I think we're cooking now. We got good leaf coverage. They're coming through our camera scene. I think this is going to look really great. The only thing we'll need to do now is take out the shadow from our emitter here. And you can just check out the show emitter in the render and the viewport. And that's going to provide some great movement to our scene and add more variation to our scene and just another layer of realistic environment detail. And now let's see if we can add some animation to our grass here to add a little bit of like a wind movement. And this is where Botaniq can come in handy with adding animation to these, because otherwise you would need to adjust each model, add in a shape key, adjust it in sculpt mode with like a wave, and then loop this animation. But let's see if Botaniq can help us with that. So we'll need to convert our models here into linked. So to add a wind animation, this is where Botaniq comes really in handy. I do recommend this add-on. It's not too expensive, and you can add in some great environment details. So with this animation here, we can add a wind animation, a simple one, make it an automatic instance, hit OK, and now we can adjust the strength of the breeze and how many frames to loop it. We can loop it for 320. We can see here we have a little animation here. Let's adjust our strength to maybe a 0.15. Let's see that difference. And now let's add it to our last grass object here. We need to convert it to a linked, and then convert it back to editable. Add animation, automatic instance. And now we have wind animation on all of our grass. And now we can go back to our camera and let's spawn our grass particle system to test this and make sure everything's working. And this is why we double check everything. Now let's preview our scene. And even without rendering our scene now with all these details added in, we can look at our scene prior to adding these details, how it was looking before, and just the improvement now of how much more realistic detail is added in. We have our atmosphere layers back here, we have shadows being casted from our cloud plane, our leaf particle system is casting shadows and moving through the scene, our grass is animated now, and this aspen tree here. So now we can go and render everything out again. But before we do that, I'll go over what our view layers are going to be for when we render out, and what needs to be hold out and what needs to be indirect light. So for our foreground layer, I have the midground as indirect only, background, water, and sky as indirect only. For our second layer, the water, I have our foreground as indirect only, then our midground as holdout and indirect, background indirect, and our sky is indirect only as well. Our midground will be similar, so foreground, background, and sky are indirect only, and then the water is holdout and indirect only. The background is foreground, midground, and sky as indirect, and then the water as holdout. And I took off the cloud planes here. And then for our sky layer, I did everything as indirect and then turned off our sky plane or our cloud planes here too. And then in the compositing, what you'll want to do is just reset your render folder. So make your set of folders here and pick which one it needs to go to. Click accept, and then over here in our node, for file subpath, input what you need for it, so water underscore, and then it'll be 01, 02, 03. Render settings are still the same as last video, the 2560 by 1080, 30 frames per second, 300 frames. I'm using 512 samples in the render, denoising with my GPU, added a motion blur, and the color management I adjusted to be a medium high contrast. Okay, one last thing before we render out I want to go over is that I adjusted the scale of our noise texture in the water. That way we can have more reflection off the water when it renders out. So I adjusted the scale of the noise texture to 500, and I adjusted the distance to 500 and the ambient inclusion. And then I adjusted the distance on our bump to a 0.25. Alright, I think that should be it, and you're good to render. May the Blender gods and goddesses be on your side, and your computer make it through it. See you on the other side. Whew, we made it, and our computer did not combust into flames. I'm happy we're here together. Alright, now that we have all of our frames rendered out separately, we can go back into our composite file that we made from part 1. And this is why it's handy to have a separate composite file in Blender, because now all you have to do is reload all these layers with our new foreground, water, midground, background, and sky layer. And for this render, I honestly kept everything the same from part 1, but what you could also be adding in to some of these layers is RGB curves to bump up contrast or adjust value with hue, saturation, and value node. But honestly, just have fun with the compositing, because you can change the whole color scheme with something, you can add in more blur, you can add in more gradients. Truly just have fun and be creative with it. There's no wrong answers when you're being creative. And then when you're ready to render out the final scene, just make sure your resolution is set to the 2560 by 1080. You have 30 frames per second, 300 frames, and then make sure you update your output to the new final render file. Also, I don't know if I went over this in part 1, but when I'm in the compositing part of the environment design, I leave this part in Eevee when I render out, because it's just rendering out images. So I think that's it. And if you have any questions or if you got stuck anywhere, please leave it in the comments. And let's render this out and take a look at what we made. Now I think our scene looks amazing, and with these extra layers of detail that we added, it really makes a difference from our first render to the next render. And I hope this helps you learn some of the basics and just some of these details that can really take your render to the next step. And it really is and it's such a fulfillment to be able to create something that seems so realistic and be able to easily do that using Blender. There's still things that we could do to improve this environment design, and we can take that to a more advanced tutorial, but I'm trying to keep it as a beginner friendly tutorial where we're just going over particle systems, different atmosphere layers, but we could add in physics where the leaves actually fall and rest on the ground, or having the leaves actually fall on the lake and start floating on the lake. Just certain physics and other little details that would take it even further than what it is now. I just want to congratulate you on completing this environment design tutorial, and I hope this helped, and I hope you learned something in this video. Be sure to like and subscribe down below and hit that bell, that way you don't miss out on any future Blender tutorials or any 3D printing tutorials. Oh, and make sure to leave a comment down below in what you want to see as a next Blender tutorial or what you want to see 3D printed. And until next time, stay creative and stay safe. Peace.